Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I know we have a few people who are still being added to the call, but if you want to introduce yourself or share anything about the questions you have or the systems challenge that you're working on, please feel free to add them to the chat box here, and we will go through them as the hour progresses. So please feel free to be submitting things there. We're joined by Rob Bersigliano from the Omidyar group for the final office hours session. So you saw him at the beginning of the course, and he's back very helpfully to answer questions yet again. And Rob, I don't know if you want to kick things off just by talking a little bit about finding leverage and like where people should be or what they should be thinking about at this stage in the process. I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Sorry. Yeah, I think this is the part of the whole process that is kind of this big so what. Like, so we spend all this time building these maps, which are really important, and deeply understanding context before we indulge ourselves in the question of, well, what should we do? And you're sort of making that turn around the bend where it's really good to like step back from your day-to-day, from what you want to do or what you have been doing, and understand the context. And now you're sort of stepping in a little bit and saying, not what do I do? Because they're still not at that question yet, but it's asking the system basically, where are the opportunities for you to profitably or productively engage? Again, devoid of the question of whether you will, because you can't, and it won't make sense for you to engage in any potential area for opportunity for leverage rather. But you sort of, it's part of that inductive process. So it's like, what is the context? What is it? What's making it the way it is? What opportunities are in that for finding higher impact opportunities for engagement? And then of those, which ones do we actually want to engage with? So there's the turn from understanding context to starting to think about how you would engage that context and what opportunities are there. And then this is also before the kind of the next big turn, which is, okay, if you look at the sort of potential opportunities, get into sort of strategy making, which is where does it make sense for us to engage? And then sort of next is your implementation plan. And so one is, I just kind of want to frame it as, look at the journey, right? So you spent a lot of time on context, which oftentimes is what we spend no time on or very little time on. Or we worry about context just to sort of say, what can I hook my favorite intervention onto? So we've kind of scrapped that and said, let's really understand context for what it is, descriptively. And then it's what are the opportunities to what's the strategy to what do we do? And the typical path, I mean, as someone who found and ran an NGO for many years, we would almost always start with, what are we going to do? Like, we'd start with that last box and try to, sort of fashion a justification for that, and then get the money and get on with doing it. So this is taking us on a very different path. So just wanted to sort of see what we're talking about in that journey. So we're rounding the bend from just understanding context for understanding what is, so that we can not start to think about what to do about it. And then we still have those stages of build a strategy and actually build an implementation plan after that.
Great, very helpful. So people can feel free to chime in here if you have any questions, or just unmute your microphone and feel free to speak directly to Rob. I think he'd be happy to answer questions about any stage of the systems practice journey at this point, but in particular, if you're stuck on anything related to leverage points, we're happy to address those too. Fiona, I know one of our catalysts, Fiona, is also on the call. So if you have seen anything, Fiona, as you've gone through assignments or been answering questions in the discussion forums and you think is worth having Rob address, you can feel free to elevate those questions too. Okay, Patricia has a question. I'm working on factors affecting low representation of women in leadership positions in tech companies. Her question is it worth it to add some that are very challenging? For example, changing the law. And I'm assuming that means as a leverage point.
Yeah, I mean, so the hard part about this first stage is really let the map be your guide. In other words, if you follow the sort of methodology of looking for where there might be potential indicators of leverage, or where there's indicators of where the system is frozen, in other words, places where you don't want to go, or you don't want to, you're unlikely to find leverage. I would ask that question in sort of an objective sense before I make the decision about, well, yeah, maybe changing the law might be a potential opportunity for leverage, but we would never do that, so why even include it? Well, you should include it for a couple of reasons. So one is even though you may not engage with that opportunity, if it's a true opportunity, you probably want to be alert to who is. Is anybody addressing that? Or can we encourage others to do it if it's that important to us or that important to our success? So that I would ask that question. And the other thing I would reason I would ask it is just because as you live with your map over time, you can come back to that question of, well, is it really? And maybe we didn't engage it because we thought it was not something that was either accessible or going to or feasible. But what we found with some of our teams is there might be opportunities for leverage which they decided not to engage with for whatever reason. Let's say that they didn't feel like they had any ability to access that. Let's say they didn't really have any contacts or ability to affect the legislative process, so they decided not to go toward legal or policy changes as a possible opportunity. But then once they start engaging with the system, they find that in fact they do have the ability to engage that. So we've had teams which have sort of said they've blocked off a particular opportunity for leverage is not where they wanted to start, but found actually it was more accessible than they thought it was going to be, and so that they actually then ended up switching to it. So it might be an area where you want to monitor and see if anybody is engaging with that. And the second is you might find and sort of as you live with your system, as you engage with it, that an opportunity you didn't want to go to at first ends up being one that actually might really be important to you.
That's very helpful, and hopefully that answers your question.
And I say, Patricia, I would just say, like at the beginning, ask that question of where are there opportunities using those sort of indicators of leverage. Just do that, straight out, and see if changing the law, for example, shows up as a promising opportunity for leverage. Then that's an important piece of information for you, even if you end up not acting on it.
And Jay's asking if there'll be a recording afterwards, and there will be in case your internet connection. So we'll share that afterwards. All right, for that. Rob, I don't know. I know it's in the workbook, but do you just want to talk through quickly, like how someone should go about? They've done all the work of creating their systems map. Where should they even start looking for leverage, or how do they start to conceptualize what that should be?
Sure. So if you've got a sort of minimally viable map, let's say a sufficiently viable map, one that it is worth engaging with. It's a good enough picture of what is that you can start to work with it. And even if you feel like you haven't gotten there, but for the purposes of sort of learning the exercise in this kind of a class, this kind of a course, it's worth, if you're going to that next step. There's just a series of questions that we ask people to do, and it's oftentimes really helpful to have in front of you a physical representation of the map. So if you can do it if you've done your work in Kumu and you're able to get Kumu to send you a PDF of that map, it's useful then to print that out at a fairly, at least a placemat size, or 11 by 17 inch in the US size. Basically, so you can literally engage with the system, and so you see all of it in front of you. But once you've got that, then it's a question of looking around and saying, first, where's the system frozen? In other words, where are there parts of the system, a dynamic or a factor, that is just really not likely to change in the foreseeable future? So I was doing some work in Cambodia, and someone had said that at the national level, politics are frozen for a decade. Well, if that's true, right, that's a sign that there's probably not leverage there of actually going to that point. So the thought there is that places where the system is already in flux. I mean, every system has places that are frozen and set versus others where there's changes happening at a much more rapid pace. That it's easier to have impact if you're nudging something that's already moving than if you're trying to get something that's stuck unstuck. So it's sort of like this economy of effort sort of principle. So first you want to know where is the system basically frozen, and then after that you're looking for places where there's sort of change already organically happening in the system, and then there's a series of other questions that kind of are clicked down from that about where is there energy for change in the system. So this could be a place where there's energy, there's something that's motivating people already to start to try to affect their system, or it could be latent. In other words, there's something blocking this. So there might be a huge groundswell for reform, but it's actually not taking shape. It's not being acted on because of some other dynamics that are impeding it. But still, there's that energy there, right? So it's good to know where is there energy in the system that is propelling or could propel change, and that we can get behind. So our job would be to unlock that energy or to channel that energy or to encourage that energy. There are one of my favorite sort of opportunities for leverage is what we call a mixed bag, where it could be a factor that is sometimes leading to positive outcomes and sometimes leading to negative outcomes. And so what we need to do is really affect the mix. So it's not like we're going to try to create the change. The change is already happening. But what we're trying to do is get it to have more positive consequences than negative consequences. So I was working with a group looking at community conflict in the DRC, and a lot of which revolved around land. And they tagged this notion of community resilience as being a factor that was a dynamic that was making lots of stuff happen. But sometimes community resilience actually worsened conflict. It led to violence when communities, in response to some sort of external stress, pulled into themselves. So they actually cut ties with people outside of their community or outside of their ethnic group. That actually worsened tensions that led to more conflict, versus times when resilience took the form of people reaching out across lines. So the question is, well, why does it happen one way or the other? Like so you might have to zoom in a little bit on that one, but it's just good to have to spot that part of your system, because that offers an opportunity for leverage. One that's actually got recently, or in the last 5 or 6 years, has gotten a lot of positive or more treatment in the research and literature are what people call bright spots. So positive deviance, where something is happening positive in it, even though everything around it is kind of negative. But these people are countering the trend. This community is, or this organization is. What can we learn from that? And can we actually? So the leverage might be: can we expand the bright spot? Can we get behind that and maybe try to replicate it or connect it to other communities that don't work this way? So there's other like, where is there high potential for sort of ripple effects in the system, where a change in one place might actually then affect might have lots of second and third order impacts around the system. So this is a series of questions that's in the workbook that people can look at. But you're basically, as a colleague of mine says, interrogating your map. You're basically saying, okay, if this is the system, now let me ask it some questions. Where is it frozen? Where is there energy for change? Where are there bright spots? Where are there mixed bag outcomes? And then that for me is then my guide to understanding where should I engage, which is still before the question of how to engage, right? So again, the advice being, don't let how to engage influence where you think there's potential opportunities. Better to have potential opportunities and then decide which ones you have the most ability to affect.
Very helpful. And Patricia's asking again, is there a good place to find an example for the case studies that are in the course of how their leverage opportunities kind of played out? I'm wondering if the best place to point people is Humanity United's really nice report on their website that kind of walks through their entire systems practice journey. That I think breaks out leverage points, doesn't it?
Well, I think they talk about their approach, like how they use systems to help them understand where there's potential opportunities for leverage. We sort of revised assignment 7 for this go round to try to somewhat simplify the sort of leverage hypothesis process, but basically by saying the analysis you do with that leverage analysis that I went through should help guide you to think, where do you want to engage your system? Where are the opportunities that you are perhaps have a distinct advantage or add distinct value in coming towards. So if you're an organization, for example, that might be actually well set up on the policy side, maybe opportunities for leverage that deal with policy might be where you have a distinct advantage and you want to go. Or Humanity United, for example, like one of the things that they are distinctly able to do is they've got great vertical connections. So they've got connections from groups on the ground to national to global, policy to practice. And so some of the opportunities for leverage that really call for kind of a networking play or social capital play tend to be ones that fit their profile better than ones that don't. So this basic idea of where do you want to let this analysis of the system and opportunities for leverage guide you to focus on where the one or two places you think you want to engage your system. Then think about how. So what would we do for that? And there's some general sort of systems advice on that, but it's also just what are we good at? Like where are our strengths and our weaknesses as an organization, and both in an absolute sense, but also relative to others in your environment. And then it's to think about, and where do we have the capability to engage? So that's the sort of thought of that assignment 7 is basically say, let all this analysis that you've done be your guide to helping you figure out where in the system, how, and then what's your capability, what's your ability to sort of to deliver on that, to follow that sort of how, that sort of process or that intervention. Do you have the capability to actually do it? And one of the problems we face a lot is our reach exceeds our grasp a lot, which I love as a sort of optimistic kind of person. But there's a part about strategy making, which is you can't let your reach exceed your grasp too much, right? Because you're going to end up being frustrated, and those you work with are going to end up being frustrated. So it's having that honest kind of conversation with your organization, with your team about, well, what are we actually really able to do? And then you might find, hey, we're really ambitious, but we're not going to be able to do that. We just don't have the capacity. So you've got to go back and say, maybe we engage somewhere else, or we have to change how we engage that spot. I would say for that part of the process, don't overload it. Don't overthink it. Those are pretty straightforward questions, and they are themselves not strategy, but they're necessary sort of precursors to producing a good strategy, is having a clear idea of where you want to engage the system, how you want to engage it, and do you have the capacity or the capability to engage it?
Super. And just to follow up to Patricia's question, I put a link to the chat box to the kind of beautiful website that Humanity United has produced. If you're watching this recording, it's called Performance Report, Systems Thinking 2014 to 2017. And that kind of builds upon the case study that is in the reading to help you see how they took leverage points and start to pull them into strategy a bit more concretely. So the link is in the chat box there. And then, let's see, we had some other great questions come in. So one from Chris is, as you're looking for leverage points, can you more deeply describe the distinction between focusing on forces versus focusing on the actors and how to get them to do something different?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when it kind of goes to that level of questions. So when you look at where to engage, you really want to look at the forces in the system. So this is sort of agnostic about how or whether you're going to engage it. It's basically just a question of where are there dynamics in the system that if you were to affect, you were to strengthen or weaken or create a new one, would deliver a potentially high, return for you. When you ask the question about the people, right, the actors in the system, that's a really relevant question around um, uh, how to, and it may also go to that question of where do you lend distinct value. So there may be opportunities in the system or forces in the system that you're well positioned to engage because you've got a great network, right? You might have a very vertically integrated network that goes from sort of people working on the ground and wrestling with these issues, day to day, to those at a sort of a national or even global sort of policy or funding level that you can influence. So when you start to think about actors in the system, both people on the ground who sort of are showing up or are key, forces in the system itself, or those that you could work with as part of a network to create change, it sort of straddles the where do you want to play, and then certainly how you want to play and how you want to engage. I guess I would start though on that question of what are the key forces that you actually want to engage with, and then go to that next level of then who are the people particularly involved in that, in either part of the key actors in that dynamic, or key actors to help engage that dynamic, who might actually help change it, affect it. It's just a subtle distinction, but I would hold the actor question until you start to get into where do we have distinct value, because part of that distinct value is going to be based on our network of relationships. And then certainly how, where there might be relationships you don't have, but that you need to build, or people you need to get involved with your work because they're key actors in addressing that particular dynamic or that particular force. Not sure if I got, I want to make sure I got the question, but yeah.
Yeah, I think you did. Could you talk through, like in the case of either that example from Cambodia or the DRC, like what is one leverage point they identified, and then how did they start to think about who the actors might be that would be involved?
Yeah, so like take the DRC one around community resilience. So part of what they would need to do is to say, first, do we really understand that dynamic? So you have these sort of, it's actually in some ways three dynamics. There's one dynamic around that drives community resilience, and then there's a couple of other dynamics around violent conflict, either that resolve that conflict or that promote that violent conflict, that spin off of that. So you're actually talking about this sort of nexus of three dynamics. And so one of the questions was a research question, which was why? Like, so do we really understand why either the community resilience dynamic works the way that it does, or that those dynamics around violence that spin off of it, work the way that they do, and what makes the difference? Like, what causes the community to go one way, like basically intra-group bonding that tends to heighten tension and conflict or violence, and what drives the bridging social capital response, where they actually reach out across group lines to become more resilient. So one is simply a research question, and then as you ask that question, it's sort of like, well, okay, who? Like, so let's take some cases where this has happened, and do we start that research by talking to people who've lived it, either on the ground or as community organizations or external actors who've been involved in that. And so basically the first sort of the first play wasn't actually a direct leverage play, if you will. It was like it was a let's understand this better. We have a hypothesis that there's an opportunity for leverage here, but it assumes that there's some knowable difference between why the system reacts violently in some cases and non-violently in other cases. And if we could test that hypothesis through some additional research, then if we actually found out, we might have then a series of other hypotheses that say, well, we have a hypothesis for if X happens, it breaks to the violent side, and if Y happens, it breaks to the non-violent side. And so all that though is going to be strengthened based on your work with others. So if that's not if it's not an answer you can provide yourself, who in the system is going to help you, investigate that initial question of why does it work one way versus another way. I think in the Cambodia question, what was really interesting was it was first an exercise in anti-leverage. So there was an organization who had been funding work at the national political level, and what the map basically said was it was, even though it was like the conventional wisdom of strengthening opposition parties, that it was also a high risk strategy, and that there were other strategies that would equally sort of advance the issue of democratization, but that didn't engage the sort of repression against political parties. So there could be a way to do it. So basically for them, it was like a warning sign, first of all. Second, it was then to say, okay, if what are the other opportunities that are outside of that dynamic? So you have like the national political dynamic that we say is relatively frozen according to the map. What are the other dynamics? There was like an economic dynamic or a series of economic dynamics that actually could influence the democratization of politics better than the direct sort of a direct assault on or approach to on national politics. And so that basically it led to the opportunity of, well, where else could we be working? How could we be working? Who do we need to be talking to? How do we start test? How do we develop the hypotheses? How do we test them? How do we actually start to act on them? In that.
That's great. And I think that actually starts to point to some connections between different plus acumen courses. So I think hopefully you use this course to kind of map your system and identify a potential point of leverage and develop a leverage hypothesis. And then in our social impact analysis course, that also starts with kind of formulating a hypothesis based on where you think you can most effectively create change. And then some methodologies to actually validate that with customers or with the people you're trying to serve or with other stakeholders in the system. So I think if people are looking for kind of the points of connection between how you start to take a hypothesis and formulate that into a theory of change or other ways to move your ideas forward, that's the next logical step to go to, I think.
Also, I mean, the folks who they haven't done the design thinking courses. So the design sort of process, the human-centered design processes, there's a lot of elements of that that are really helpful to say, hey, we think this community resilience dynamic is a potential opportunity for leverage. So to help us to actually design a way of accessing that, let's involve users. Let's involve people, on the who are knowledgeable or more knowledgeable than we are about how to actually get traction on that.
The other questions that we have come in are lots of kind of logistical things about how intensive this course is and when is it going to be offered next. And I will say that this is a theme across the board. We are seeing a lot of questions like this, and as I've been talking to people, the same thing is happening. So just to clarify, this course will close November 21st. That is the final date for all assignments to be submitted. That does build in 2 weeks of buffer time. So beyond the kind of, if you've been keeping up with the weekly cadence of assignments, you'll have 2 weeks to finish things up and submit everything by November 21st. So even if you're a little bit behind now, there's still time to catch up. We then will offer it again beginning February 13th. So if you want to kind of save your work and start the course again in February, you can re-upload your assignments there if you want some time in the interim to continue working on things in a bit more detail. And Kumu, I will confirm with Jeff when you have final access to the platform, but I think he said he would give about a month of buffer time to continue to access your system map there. So if you do have other questions, please feel free to email us with those particulars. But I guess, Rob, do you have any recommendations for people that are trying to, like, they're at a point right now, they feel like they're a little stuck, they feel like they're behind, like, what advice would you give to them?
So it would, there's a bit of an artificiality in the pace of the course around the gap between like getting a deep structure, even a sort of an initial version of a map to a map that you sort of that you actually think is a good sufficient understanding of the system. Usually for our teams, that is the area that takes the longest. And it's really a function of how much socialization, how much iteration that you want to do. And in a lot of ways, that's the most helpful part of the process. So people are building relationships, they're getting new knowledge, building their network. And so it's not unusual that that's where people are. I would say that if that's where you're at, you've got like an initial set of loops. You've even got a deep structure. You've started to fashion them into a map. But can see that this is going to take more time to really get a credible map together. Is don't rush that process at this point, because it may take you like between now and February in any event to do a good socialization of your map. So that can be a really good investment of time, is to thoughtfully build your map in consultation with others. If you're looking to kind of get a sort of start to finish, I just want to understand all the steps, and I'm not necessarily building a map that I'm going to use, this has been more of an academic exercise for you or for your team, then I would say don't sweat the details. I would actually go through the steps between now and the 21st, just to get one experience of going from start to finish under your belt, and then it's a step back and say, okay, if we're going to do this now in a more sort of focused, conscientious way, then actually I might actually take the time between now and February to form a team or to work with your team and actually get ready for doing this in a deeper kind of way. So I guess there's really two ways to think about this. One is, don't rush to the end if you're sort of, especially on, want to do a more thoughtful job of map building. I would invest the time to do that, because you easily could use the time between now and February to do that. And then second, if you're really trying to get this more of an academic experience for you, I would complete the process without. So even if you have a very simple map, and even if your hypotheses for leverage are really, in your own mind kind of questionable, I would say if you're not gonna, if those hypotheses aren't going to be actually supporting intervention work in the near future, go through the process just to kind of learn the process once. So the next time you go through it, it's going to be a lot easier and a lot faster.
Yeah, and I would echo that too. I think you can use that same kind of approach for lots of Plus Documents courses. You can sign up as many times as you want. You can use them at the first pass to learn the method, learn the process, and then take it again once you have a real project and you want to use that cadence to kind of work through the specifics with your team or group. So we get questions a lot around whether there's penalties if you don't complete and you try to sign up again. No, the courses are continuously open. So while we would encourage you to try to finish, just because I think it is useful to get that experience, you're welcome to come back as many times as you want. It just says thanks for the encouragement. And let's see. Joseph's asking, which resources from the course can I still download and where? So all of the resources are still available in the course. You will have access to all course materials through November 21st. So that includes the workbooks, the readings, and the full version of the workbook if you want that to continuously access. There is a Dropbox folder there, which you can save locally to your desktop if you want to continue to access the materials even after November 21st. So hopefully that helped. Let's see, any other questions? Just one on Kumu, it looks like, which I can circle back with Jeff on. Otherwise, people can feel free to add additional questions for Rob. Otherwise, we can wrap up a bit early. Unless, Rob, you have any other words of advice you think people should hear.
I mean, if everybody can the workbook is sort of it's not a standalone document. In other words, just the workbook is not enough to actually help you work through this process. But it is a pretty coherent guide, like that walks you through it. So I would say even if that was the one thing you could take away, that you use the workbook as your resource going forward. The thing that I always say to groups is wherever you're at around understanding systems and complexity, if you're an enthusiast or you're a skeptic, the only way you really learn about it is to do it. So I'm sure the videos that I'm in are like wildly helpful. That's sarcastic. And those can be helpful for you to take the next step, but you have to learn by doing. And also that kind of means that you can do it with at least a partner, if not a small group. Because part of the process you really want to get down is how do we work collectively? How do we sense make as a group? And that's something that is just it's beyond the specifics of this process. It's the ability to work well in groups, to engage, understand, and then engage complex systems is like kind of the meta, if you will, process or the meta lesson from all this. So I think even without the course platform, the workbook is going to be at least a minimal sort of guide through that that you can continue to work on and continue to work on with your colleagues. So I would say just look for ways to keep practicing even after the course, whichever point you get to in this part of the course. It's probably really helpful to think about how are you going to keep practicing? What's your process?
How have you seen kind of teams, once they go through this full systems practice journey or systems mapping exercise, how do they keep kind of embedding a systems approach into the everyday work that they do to make sure they're carrying their learning forward? Have you seen any kind of tactical ways teams do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that is helpful about this is that even when we've had teams that formed to do the systems process here within Omidyar, that what they basically do is they start to learn how to work as a team. And even though they might be working in offices next to each other or even sometimes on the same issues, they haven't actually worked as a team. So I would say the process of having some sort of structure around which they work together. So one of the things that actually has really been helpful is even sort of minimal sort of learning sessions. We kind of call them flash learning sessions, where people are able to sort of step back and say, we're just in the field, or we're just, we just had a series of really important meetings. Let's step back and reflect on what just happened. Let's step back and reflect on how we're working together. So those things that you can do that are part of sort of good team practice, regardless of the systems, if you use our systems process or any process, is a really important thing to keep up. So it's like flexing those muscles or developing those muscles of how to work together as a team, how to make sense together, how to learn together, how to plan together. Those are really important activities to continue as you go through. And I would say that the learning one is probably the most helpful, because that will both get the team sort of skill and process down, but will also actually be quite helpful to you substantively. Back when I used to do a lot of negotiation and mediation work, we were always asked to come in and do training, which we did a fair amount of. But what we would say is we would stop teaching how to good negotiation skills. We would teach preparation for negotiation and debrief of negotiations. And I think the same is with how you engage with systems. It's can you prepare together, and can you debrief together? If you do those things, two things really well, you're going to sort of start to take care of the engaged systems part, actually, over time. It's going to get better over time.
Lots of wise words of advice there. Don't see any other questions coming in, so we'll give people one more minute in case they have any other burning issues. But otherwise, I think we'll just wrap up by wishing everyone good luck. Do feel free to reach out if you have any further questions. You can post them in the discussion forums. The Catalyst will see them there, or email courses@plusacumen.org, particularly if you have any kind of logistical questions about how or what to submit. We're happy to help there. But otherwise, thanks again, Rob, for tuning in. And we will post this recording for anyone who wants to review it if you didn't catch it all during one sitting. So thanks again.
Yeah, one of the things I like to say, sorry, Amy, is start to look for there's other tools, there's other guides. So just make this, if this is the beginning of your systems inquiry and journey, keep it up. And so it's both working as a team, but also sort of look at other things now, so that you'll start to see what are the messages that are repeating and what really works best for you and your team over time.
Do you have any specific recommended tools or resources that people check out in addition to the course?
Yeah, so there's some stuff from like the GeoFunders on systemic grant making, which actually has this great sort of toolkit around systems. It's in some ways overwhelming, but if you're kind of now more of an educated consumer in this space, if now that you've gone through this, please go and check that out. Bridgeway Partners has a series of resources. So David Stroh's, a lot of David Stroh's work I think is really helpful. The Systems Thinker, which is a website and newsletter, has lots of resources on it. So, and Kumu too. Actually, Kumu has great resources embedded in it.
Great. Okay, so I've added those 3 links for Bridgeway Partners, Systems, GeoFunder, and Kumu to the chat box. I know Kumu also has a great Friday newsletter they send out, so that's something I would encourage you to look at too. And most of those are also posted at the resources page of the course. So great suggestions, lots of reading for everyone to do. Thanks again, Rob.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Good luck.